Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of History Quest. This month we're going to tell you a story about some bears at Buffalo Creek as well as the bank robbery in Brownton. So stay tuned for a little McLeod County history. The buckshot exploded from the muzzle of the old shotgun in a blazing inferno that launched it towards a charging bear. He was a brute, massive among even the biggest bears that roamed the timbers of the big woods. The load of buckshot hit him square in the chest, yet it did marginal damage and merely slowed the old Bruin down. Another shot rang out, this time a .50 caliber ball that surged from a muzzle and found its way deep into the bear's flesh. In an instant, the massive brute stopped charging, began to rise on its hind legs, towering over the three hunters below, let out a roar so monstrous that it shook the very earth the bear stood upon. He then fell back to all fours and looked at the hunters with menacing eyes. The hunters could see plainly that this monster of a bear was hurt. The bear again tried to charge, but this time stumbled over its massive paws and fell to the ground. A sweeping touch of relief swept over them, but it was short-lived. Behind the beast that was struggling to raise itself off the ground appeared another bear, and it was just as large as the one they just fought. The year was 1853. In the North Country wilderness, William L. Quinn was considered a man of the times. He was 26 years old and termed a mixed blood, a combination of Irish and Native American heritage. During the fall of that year, William Quinn embarked on a hunting expedition into the famed big woods of central Minnesota. With him came a man named George LeBlanc and another unnamed person as well. All three were of European and Native American mixed ancestry, which of course was a common trait among Minnesotans of the time. The hunt took the three men into the big woods of Minnesota, a stretch of deciduous woodland that broke up the divide of eastern forest and western prairies. It was here that game was plentiful, abounding with beavers, otters, minks, and wildfowl. In addition, there were bear, wolves, and the occasional panther. The three hunters were after the deer that abounded in the thickets that outlined the big woods. The little hunting party eventually found themselves in the area known today as McLeod County. They made camp somewhere along the banks of Buffalo Creek. At nightfall, the three men were awakened by the sound of a bear. It was rustling through their camp, looking for something to eat. The three sprang from their bedrolls and frightened the bear away, but not before it made away with some of the food they had packed for the trip. When dawn came, the three hunters went off to track the bear they encountered the night before. Eventually, they came upon him and the fight ensued. The second bear on the scene that came crashing in tried hard to inflict damage on the three hunters. Undoubtedly, they had to find a way to hold it off while reloading their weapons from the first attack before killing that bear. With the fight over, the men tried to collect themselves from the attack. A few moments later, the three men heard snarling and growling coming from 50 yards away. It was yet another bear, this time a large female who was no doubt a consort of one of the large males. All three men fired at once, killing the bear before she had a chance to charge. For a time, the story of the three bears at Buffalo Creek was a regional folk tale. It even made its way into the St. Paul Pioneer Press some years later. Today, as we drive our busy roads and live our busy lives, it's all too easy to forget what our world was like not so long ago. Where we now see a sprawling city or town was once a sprawling wilderness, where life could hang in the balance of one's wits and ability. Those small portions of the land may be reminiscent of what it once was. It is a mere shell of the great wilderness that once abounded in our own backyards.
None of the towns in our area was founded. McLeod County was not platted at all. Most of this area was not platted whatsoever.
No, it was actually, we were still a territory at that time.
That's true.
Yeah.
There's no way to connect the wilderness. The only real way of travel is by river.
There's, I wouldn't call them roads per se. It was
Pathways.
trails. Yeah, pathways, trails. And there, of course, you had the ox cart trails because you did have a presence in Minnesota, going back thousands of years. And, things like your ox cart trails were built upon, human footpaths from the Native Americans who were here at the time. And then you have, when your whites start showing up in this part of the country or this far west, and they start bringing in trade routes, they're just going right over the top of where the Native Americans already had their paths. So you actually, what's kind of neat, you start getting into like central Minnesota, and even down here in southern Minnesota and parts of northern Minnesota, where you have your 3 Red River ox cart trails coming through, because it comes from Pembina, and then it comes south, and they kind of split up a little bit. One goes south into southern Minnesota, one goes over the northern part of Stearns County, and one goes a little bit north of that. And they all eventually converge with one another in what's now the Twin Cities. At that time would have been St. Anthony, or Pig's Eye as they used to call it. At any rate, those today are major highways. I-94 corridor.
Yep.
Comes right through there. And what's interesting is, and this kind of goes right into the story about the wilderness in our own backyards. People drive that every day. A lot of people drive that every day. It's a major artery for traffic in Minnesota. But few people realize that you're basically driving over an ancient Indian footpath.
Maybe.
Which is just kind of, in some ways, it's kind of almost sobering, humbling to think about.
And just to imagine all the farms that we drive through, especially on 94, all those farm fields, none of that was there in this time period. It was wild, and it was natural. And these men decided to live here and settle here amongst the bears.
Amongst the bears, yep.
The bears.
There's all. If you really start digging into it, I mean, there's stories of elk, timber wolves, bear, all kinds of large animals that are no longer in this part of the state. Even like, you take moose that are disappearing from northern Minnesota, and they used to abound in the state. Now that's not due to overhunting or anything, that's due to a disease that they have that's, slowly diminishing the population. But it's just hard to believe, or well, maybe not hard to believe, but hard to imagine, the routes we walk to the store or whatever, and to think that, to look out and not see any of that, and maybe see a wolf standing, along the river or something.
It's hard to imagine a flourishing forest and prairie even in this area.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you get to certain areas where you have like government programs like the set-aside programs and stuff. And you can kind of get an idea of what it might look like.
There is Schaefer's Prairie near Brownton, I believe.
Right. But yeah, it's you really have to get out there. And the thing is, in central and southern Minnesota, there's very few places left that are quote-unquote wild. You know what I mean? And when I say wild, just to the fact where there hasn't been some sort of
development.
Yeah, development, whether it's a farm or whether it's a field.
Or even just a gravel road.
There's no, I guess the best way to put it is the back 40 that people had, 40 years ago, basically are gone. There are no back 40s in this part of the state anymore. When you get up in northern Minnesota, it's a little bit different, but that land's not really as conducive to the development and to the farming that we have around here. But it's just, I've always found it, fascinating just to think of what could have happened, like I said, in your own backyard. What transpired there. We don't know. You might have had a settler or a fur trader or something, setting up camp there.
And fur trading was well established in Minnesota at this time. So there were people moving around.
Right, and the fur trade is really, that's what led to your ox carts and everything. And it's, the Native Americans in the area were really the, they were the, not proprietors, but they were the ones doing all the work in the fur trade. It's not, we have this classic image of the fur trade where you have these mountain men in coonskin hats and fringed buckskins with their Kentucky long rifles, traveling in groups and singing manly songs down the river and everything as they're going and trapping beaver and whatnot. And that may have been, true in a sense, you know, and I put a lot of emphasis on in a sense.
Because that's what Martin McLeod did.
Right.
He was a fur trader.
But it was that's true in a sense when you get out into like the Rocky Mountains, you know, where your fur traders are groups of, you know, white Europeans out there trying to capture furs. But here in Minnesota, it was a lot different. Your quote unquote mountain man or white fur trader rarely went out and trapped by himself. What he was what they would basically refer to as like a driver. Martin McLeod is a perfect example. He would go from Indian camp to Indian camp to Indian camp, different villages around, not just in this area, all over Minnesota, into North and South Dakota, the entire North Country, so to speak. He would travel around to these different villages, and he would basically tell them, okay, the market right now is in mink, or the market is in deer pelts, or what have you, whatever it was. And so he would basically is going through and bringing news, and then he's asking, you know, okay, what supplies do you need? Do you need ammunition? Do you need firearms? Do you need flour? What is it that you need? And then so he would facilitate that to have that sent to the village. Then he would go to the next village and do the same thing. So really, they were just kind of alerting the local population to what was going to make them the most money, so to speak, at the time. So it's down at the museum. One of our volunteers right now is going over letters from Martin McLeod.
It's really interesting.
It's so interesting because it paints a picture that's very, very different from what our classic view is of that time, about how he's working with the natives and how the people of that time are so concerned about the natives, because they're actually, what happens in 1862 when the Dakota and the U.S., you know, when there's this big conflict and they go to war with each other, these guys are kind of already seeing that there's potential of this happening down the road. And it's not, at this time, you know, it's not so much that the government, or, you know, that they're selling their land and they're getting a raw deal. Even though in some of the treaties they sold their land quite cheaply, but the concern is that you know, they are getting so dependent on our trade goods, and it's not, like I said, it's not like we're pushing these trade goods on them and saying you have to use this gun and you can't use your bow anymore, or you have to use this wool blanket and you can't use your buffalo robe anymore. It's basically because they have all these items coming into their village and they're like, wow, look at how much easier this makes life. Why would I want to shoot something with a bow and arrow when I've got a gun, or you know, so to speak? And so they're already seeing this taking place, and at the same time they're seeing this fur trade dwindle and diminish, and realizing that that is their only resource for these natives. This is their only resource, is the fur trade, and the fur trade is going away, and we have to find a way to be able to keep them from starving to death. And so like I said, it's very, reading through some of these letters that are being transcribed right now, it's very
eye-opening.
Yeah, to what was actually happening versus what, you know, our classic view of what was happening.
Our 21st century perspective.
Right, exactly. But and that's another thing that I think of, you know, when I read a story like this and think of Minnesota at that time and what it was like. So. Yeah.
It's very cool.
Yeah. So we are going to move forward into the 20th century, into 1924, and talk about a bank robbery in Brownton.
Cool.
And this is kind of a neat story as well. It's not as Bonnie and Clyde as you would maybe think, being the 1920s, but it's still kind of a neat little story.
It's really cool. It's this small town, Brownton.
It was a dark night in September of 1924 in Brownton, Minnesota. And the only sound in town was the clicking of Marshal Henry Sankin's heels as he walked down the sidewalk. It was 1 a.m., and while the tiny town slept, Marshal Sankin was making his rounds. He checked the doors on the shops in town, making sure they were all locked. Occasionally, he would peek inside a darkened shop window just to make sure everything was in order in the orderly little town of Brownton, Minnesota. On the outer limits of town, a new noise was heard. 5 men had just made their way into the community. They were armed, and they were planning to rob the town bank. The men had scoped out the town and had felt that what they had was a foolproof plan. They would cut the phone and telegraph lines, break into the bank, darken the interior windows, and blow the vault with nitroglycerin. You could call it bad timing if you want, but Marshall Sankin fell right into their hands. The 5 men were inside the powerhouse cutting the wires when one of them spotted the marshal walking down the sidewalk. They remained still, waiting in silence until the marshal was close enough to grab. As he walked by the powerhouse, the men reached out and grabbed him, gagged him with a rag, and had his hands tied behind his back. They took the bound marshal with them as they made their way into the bank. Once inside, they put Marshal Sankin in the basement and went to work darkening the windows. Next, they blew the vault. Or at least they tried to. The vault was made of thick steel and closed in brick and mortar. After 4 attempts to blow their way inside, they had done little but awakened several townspeople. One man who was alerted by the explosion was H.E. Sealand, a restaurant owner who lived across the street of the bank. Sealand jumped from the bed, grabbed a shotgun, and proceeded to a second-story window. He saw the commotion at the bank and fired his gun into the air, hoping it would scare the bandits away. Instead, his shot drew returning fire. Shooting from the second-floor window, Sealand had the upper hand, yet the bandits were shooting back. While they tried to scramble out of the bank, they were under constant fire from Sealand. The 5 armed men had no choice but to abandon their heist and leave town. The gunfight was sure to alarm the rest of town, and soon more people would come to the aid of Sealand. They decided to flee without the loot they sought after. They bolted from the bank and ran out of town as fast as they could, shooting out street lights and returning fire along the way. They were never caught, and the attempted bank heist in Brownton was one of 4 in the region. Cosmos, Sve, and Candy, Ojai were all targets of similar jobs. Authorities felt all 4 attempts were made by the same criminals. To this day, their identities remain a mystery.
So the guys, they attempted 4 bank robberies. And
we think. Or, well, we don't think. They thought that.
They thought. Yeah. And they weren't successful at any of them?
No, and there was actually another robbery in South Dakota, roughly around this time, that they think these guys might have been a part of.
Similar circumstances.
Yeah, but I believe the one in South Dakota, I believe they may have caught them that time.
So who were they?
I don't know. I looked, but for some reason, records weren't always kept the best. 100 years ago or so, or 90 years ago.
It is almost 100 years ago.
Yeah. Oh. But what's kind of neat is it's the 1920s. It's the Roaring 20s, right?
It is.
And you've got these bank robbers, coming into town, and they take the marshal aside and they say, "All right, we're gonna tie you up, see? We're gonna put you in the basement, see?" And then they all get together.
I was wondering how long it would take you to do that.
To do what?
See.
They're like, I'm sure one of them was named Muggsy. Come on, Muggsy.
I hope so.
Let's go rob that bank, see? Anyway, that was funny. You can all laugh. Anyway, so it's just kind of neat, and then what transpires is a little gunfight in Brownton, and it's,
the middle of the night.
Yeah.
But I first heard this story when I was reading your article in the Hutchinson Leader that's published every Sunday. Go check it out. But when I got to the part where they got quiet, I was expecting them just to wait for the marshal to walk by and them carry on their business. But they gagged him and tied him, and I was just like, why would you do that?
Well, why not? Because if they let him go, then he would be alerted to what's happening.
Or they would have just waited for him to walk further away and then carry on with their merry.
Right, but then when they would have gone and blown the bank and tried to get in there, they ran the chance of him either A, walking by, or B, hearing the explosion and alerting other people. So
the bank was in the middle of town, so their plan wasn't foolproof to begin with. Using explosions.
No, I'm sure they knew they were gonna have to flee right away. Yeah. Anyway, it's it's just kind of a cool story. I mean,
it's really cool.
You don't think of that kind of stuff happening.
No, and this gunfight broke out.
Right.
I love that the guy who lived across the street, he woke up and the first thing he did was pull out his shotgun and take position. It's
actually it's actually crazy how much into the 20th century there's gunplay and stuff going on in this county. It's McLeod County is still the Wild West. I mean, it's just crazy.
What's mine is mine, and I'm gonna hold on to it, and unless someone else is trying to take someone else's, and then I'll help you defend it, I guess.
Yeah. I have one thing I want to share with you, and this is any of you who are members, who have been members, you probably remember getting a monthly newsletter each month that just kind of gives you the going-ons of the museum, maybe a short little story about something in there.
It's fun.
We have actually done away with the newsletter and replaced it with this.
Ta-da!
A nice McLeod County magazine. Well,
It's
just
so
called
pretty.
McLeod. Extreme close-up of McLeod. All right, but
It's
it's got a feature story in it. Table of contents. I'll have my
Want me to
lovely
hold it?
assistant here hold it.
excuse you?
That's what I said. All right, and so you still get some news about what's going on. And actually, Bailey, why don't you turn the page for me?
Just keep talking.
Hey. And you have, but then you have, a feature story. This first one is actually about a frontiersman here in Hutchinson.
Because we just love this time period.
We do. And next page, please. It's hard to get good help these days. Calendar of events. We still have our donations, memorial page kind of thing going on right here. I actually asked Bailey if she would put something in there, and so she'll have a story each month in there.
The best parts of the magazine.
And then there's more to it. It's I'll take this now, please. Thank you. Thank you. You did a great job.
Do I get a raise?
No. But there's more to it than just that. But this is free with a membership. It's bi-monthly, so you get 6 editions or 6 editions. Yeah, 6 editions of this every month. If you're
every
year. If you're not a member, you can still get one of these. Just come down to the museum and purchase one for $5. But it actually comes out a little bit ahead if you just buy a membership. And
now,
pick one of these
when
up.
can they expect the next one?
The next one, so this is bi-monthly, so this was January, February. The next one will come out in March.
All right.
And we're currently laying that one out already. And we've heard a lot of good things. People really seem to like it so far. So yeah, come stop in and get yours today.
Boom.
All right. And then also, I just wanted to let you know that the museum now for February, we ought to be all back up and running. Finally. This HVAC thing is like actually coming to an end.
Right.
It's all in. They're going to fire it up here in a couple of days, and we're like, end of January here right now today. So they're going to fire it up here.
The new heating
Monday.
system is going to heat the whole building
and
now.
So then we'll just have a couple of weeks to kind of put everything back together, and we should be back in action so you can all come down. All right, anyway, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next month. So let the credits roll. I have a whole bag of shush right here for you.
That doesn't make sense, though. Are you pulling the shush out and speaking it?